All right, let's dive into Ulysses S. Grant. We all know him as this Civil War hero. But today, we're going a little deeper. We're going to be taking a look at his presidency, specifically his first term.
Yeah, I think most people don't realize, there's a whole lot to Grant's story, especially when it comes to Reconstruction.
We're really lucky to have some insights from an interview with Ann Marshall. She's the executive director of the Ulysses S. Grant Association and the U.S. Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State University.
Oh, wow. That's incredible to have his legacy examined and preserved in the heart of the former Confederacy.
It's a pretty powerful thing, I think.
It really is. It really is. And it adds a layer of complexity to understanding Grant. I mean, this is a man who not only won the Civil War, but then essentially had to wage another one against white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction. And many of those battles happened in the very state where his legacy is now studied.
That's an interesting point. So what was the situation like when Grant took office? What was the South like at that time?
Well, just imagine a place still smoldering from the war, literally and figuratively. Instead of peace and reconciliation, there was this deep-seated resentment
Huh.
and resistance to change.
Sounds chaotic.
It was. And former Confederate states had enacted black codes, which were essentially laws designed to keep African Americans in a state of near servitude.
Really?
Yeah, they restricted everything, from land ownership to job opportunities, even their freedom to travel.
Wow. So they basically tried to keep the old power structure even after slavery was abolished.
Exactly. And then to enforce these codes
Mhm.
and terrorize the black community. You had groups like the Ku Klux Klan rising up,
Right.
which were essentially paramilitary organizations that used violence and intimidation to maintain white supremacy
And that was happening a lot.
all the time. We're talking about horrific incidents like the massacre in New Orleans in 1866 and the Memphis riots the following year.
Oh, wow.
These were brutal acts of racial violence that really highlight just how volatile the time
It
was.
sounds like a powder keg.
It was. It was. And Grant saw firsthand just how dangerous the situation had become. He toured the South after the war, and he witnessed the resistance and the violence up close.
So we have this incredibly tense and volatile situation in the South. And you said Grant wasn't initially a political animal. So was he even interested in becoming president?
That's one of the fascinating things about Grant. He wasn't some power-hungry politician, scheming to climb the ladder. He was a soldier first and foremost.
Yeah.
But as the country struggled to heal, and Andrew Johnson, who'd taken over after Lincoln's assassination, really fumbled Reconstruction, Grant felt this growing sense of duty.
It's almost like Eisenhower. Another military man called upon in a time of crisis.
That's a great parallel. They were both war heroes thrust into the political spotlight when the nation needed them most.
But didn't Grant initially support Johnson?
He did for a while. He even served briefly in Johnson's cabinet, which honestly must have been a pretty awkward experience.
Yeah.
Grant was a man of action, not a fan of political maneuvering. He quickly realized that he and Johnson had very different visions for the country's future.
So you mentioned this idea of Grant evolving when it comes to civil rights. What do you think was the turning point for him? Was it seeing Johnson's policies firsthand?
It's hard to pinpoint an exact moment, but there's a clear shift in Grant's thinking. He went from focusing primarily on preserving the Union to becoming a true champion of equality for African Americans. Take, for instance, his response to the Black Codes. He saw them for what they were, an attempt to undermine the very freedoms he had fought so hard to secure.
So this was personal for him.
Yeah, this was personal for Grant.
So when Grant finally stepped into the Oval Office, what was his vision for Reconstruction? Did he side with the radical Republicans?
That's where Grant gets really interesting. He wasn't a dyed-in-the-wool radical Republican, but he absolutely shared their commitment to protecting the rights of Black Americans. And that commitment led to some truly remarkable achievements during his first term.
Okay, I'm hooked. What were some of those big wins?
Well, first, there's his collaboration with Congress. It's almost hard to imagine in today's political climate, but there was a real sense of unity and purpose. Grant understood that to truly heal the nation and bring about lasting change, he needed to work with, not against, the legislative branch.
A president who actually believed in checks and balances.
It seems so quaint, right? But that collaborative spirit led to some truly groundbreaking legislation, like the passage and enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments during Grant's first term.
The 14th Amendment granting citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. Okay. And the 15th ensuring the right to vote regardless of race.
Huge steps forward, absolutely. And Grant was instrumental in pushing them through and then ensuring they were actually enforced. This wasn't just about pretty words on paper. It was about making real change happen on the ground. It was about Black Americans finally having a voice in the government, with many former slaves even being elected to Congress.
Wow.
It was an incredible shift in power dynamics, and Grant was right at the heart of it.
What a remarkable period. It seems like Grant's first term was a time of real progress, a time when the nation took some major steps toward fulfilling its promise of equality for all.
It really was. And it's a side of Grant that often gets overshadowed by the controversies of his second term and the lingering influence of the lost cause myth. But those 4 years were a testament to Grant's commitment to justice, his willingness to work with others, and his determination to make the ideals of the Union a reality for all Americans.
So it's almost like there were two Grants. You know, the Grant of the first term pushing for all these changes, and then the Grant of the second term where things start to fall apart a little. What happened? Why the difference?
Well, I think part of it might be that Grant, the brilliant military strategist, wasn't quite prepared for the battles he'd face as president. He was used to leading troops, not managing a nation grappling with all these complex social and economic issues.
So he's a fish out of water.
In a way, yes. Remember, this is the Gilded Age we're talking about, a time of massive industrial growth, but also rampant corruption and cutthroat politics. And Grant, with his military background and straightforward style, well, he wasn't always equipped to navigate those murky waters.
Wait, but hold on. Are we saying Grant was naive? He did, after all, create the Department of Justice.
It's not so much about naivete as it is about a different skill set. You see, Grant was a master of strategy and tactics on the battlefield, but the political arena demanded a different kind of cunning. He was used to giving orders, not building consensus, or playing the game of public perception.
That's true. And this is also when the media landscape starts to shift.
You're absolutely right.
This was the rise of big media, the early days of fake news.
Exactly. Newspapers and magazines were gaining immense power, and they weren't always shy about using it to push their own agendas. You know, the seeds of what we now call yellow journalism were definitely being sown. And Grant, with his tendency to trust the wrong people and his aversion to self-promotion, he became an easy target.
Okay, so we've got economic turmoil, a changing media landscape, and Grant struggling to adapt to the political game. He also started losing allies in his second term, right?
Yes, he did. The solid support he enjoyed from congressional Republicans started to fracture, partly due to his handling of certain issues, like his push to annex Santo Domingo, which is the Dominican Republic today. This really alienated some key figures, like Charles Sumner, who was a powerful senator and abolitionist, and who had been a staunch ally during the first term.
So it's like everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
Yeah, it was a tough time. And sadly, it coincided with the rise of the lost cause myth, this romanticized, utterly false narrative about the Confederacy, and the noble reasons for the South's secession.
It's the lost cause. That's a whole other topic. How did that myth affect Grant's reputation?
Well, the lost cause myth was incredibly damaging because it rewrote history to paint the Confederacy in a sympathetic light, portraying them as victims rather than the aggressors. And within this distorted narrative, Grant, the man who defeated the Confederacy, became the villain. He was depicted as a bloodthirsty butcher, a symbol of Northern aggression and oppression.
So not just downplaying his accomplishments, but actively demonizing him.
Exactly. And this narrative wasn't confined to some fringe group. It permeated Southern culture and even seeped into mainstream American thought. You see it reflected in textbooks, literature, and even early films like Birth of a Nation, which was incredibly racist. You know, the lost cause myth cast a long shadow over Grant's legacy, obscuring the incredible progress he made during his first term and contributing to this perception of his presidency as a failure.
It's kind of heartbreaking to see a man who dedicated his life to serving his country being so misrepresented and vilified. So, with his reputation in tatters and his health failing, what did Grant do after leaving the White House? Didn't he go on a world tour?
He did. He embarked on this 2-year journey around the globe, which was a remarkable feat for the time. It really speaks to his enduring popularity on the world stage, even as his image was being tarnished back home. And when he returned, he settled in New York City, hoping to find some financial stability, which unfortunately eluded him. Grant was never particularly good with money. And he ended up losing a significant chunk of his savings in a bad investment.
That was rough.
And then came the devastating blow, a diagnosis of throat cancer, likely a result of his heavy smoking. But even in the face of financial ruin and a terminal illness, Grant's spirit remained unbroken. He found a new purpose, a final act of defiance against fate itself, writing his memoirs.
And wasn't this where Mark Twain came in to help?
Yes, Twain was a huge admirer of Grant, and he recognized the historical significance of his story and offered him an incredibly generous publishing deal through his own company. It ensured that Grant's wife, Julia, would be financially secure after his death. It was an act of true friendship, and a testament to Twain's belief in Grant's legacy.
What a story. It's amazing to think that Grant, facing his own mortality, poured his heart and soul into those memoirs, determined to leave behind his own account of the war and his presidency.
He did. And the result was a masterpiece of military history and a poignant reflection on a life dedicated to service. Imagine this, Grant, racked with pain, sitting on a porch in the Adirondack Mountains, battling cancer and racing against time to finish his manuscript.
Wow.
Talk about perseverance.
That's amazing.
It's a testament to his character, his unwavering sense of duty, even in the face of his own mortality. And the public responded. His memoirs became an instant bestseller, providing much-needed financial security for his family, and in a way, reclaiming his narrative. He finally got to tell his story on his own terms.
A beautiful example of redemption, of a man who, despite the challenges and setbacks, managed to leave behind a legacy that transcended the negativity and distortions of his time.
It really is. And his tomb in New York City, this grand mausoleum, stands as a symbol of that enduring legacy. It's a reminder that even though Grant was often misunderstood and maligned during his lifetime, his contributions to American history are undeniable.
It's amazing how his reputation has shifted over time. For decades, he was ranked poorly among presidents, largely due to the lost cause myth. But in recent years, historians have started to reevaluate his presidency, particularly those first 4 years.
It's true. There's a growing recognition of Grant's vital role in advancing civil rights and setting the stage for the more equitable society we strive for today. It's like history is finally catching up to the truth about Grant.
So why should we care about Ulysses S. Grant and his complicated journey? What can we learn from him?
Grant's story reminds us that history is not a static thing. It's constantly being reinterpreted and re-examined. And it highlights the importance of challenging dominant narratives, especially those that perpetuate injustice or obscure the truth. Just like we need to be wary of fake news today, we also need to be critical of the stories we've been told about the past.
It's a call to be active participants in understanding and shaping our collective memory.
Exactly. By digging deeper into figures like Grant. With all their complexities and contradictions, we gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of our nation's past. And perhaps more importantly, we learn valuable lessons about leadership, resilience, and the ongoing fight for justice and equality.
It's a powerful reminder that the past is never truly past. It continues to shape our present and our future.
And by learning from it, both its triumphs and its failures, we can strive to create a more just and equitable world for all.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listener? What should they keep in mind as they continue to explore his story?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that Grant was a far more complex and impactful figure than most people realize. He was a man of contradictions, a military hero who struggled with the nuances of politics, a champion of civil rights who sometimes made decisions that seemed to contradict those values. But above all, he was a man who dedicated his life to serving his country, even when it meant facing criticism, setbacks, and ultimately a tarnished reputation.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And I'd add that Grant's story is not just about him, it's about us, about our shared history and our collective responsibility to understand and learn from the past. It's about recognizing the long shadow of the lost cause myth and actively working to counter its harmful narratives.
It's about acknowledging the complexities of history and understanding that even our heroes are flawed human beings who make mistakes.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing the importance of Grant's first term, a time of remarkable progress in civil rights that's often overlooked or overshadowed by the controversies of his second term. Those 4 years were a testament to Grant's commitment to justice, his willingness to work with others, and his determination to make the ideals of the Union a reality for all Americans.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, let's keep all of that in mind. Let's continue to explore Grant's story with open minds and a willingness to challenge our assumptions. As we've been talking about Grant's legacy, I keep thinking about one thing that really struck me. In the interview with Ann Marshall, we discussed Grant's financial struggles, how he wasn't exactly a money whiz, both before and after his presidency. But then his memoirs, they become this huge success, making his wife Julia quite wealthy. It's almost like fate. A little poetic justice. Yeah.
It is fascinating how that financial success, stemming from Grant's own words, ultimately played a role in redeeming his reputation. Like his story, told authentically, in his own voice, became the key to securing his family's future and solidifying his place in history.
And to think he was battling cancer at the time.
Absolutely. It speaks to the complexities of Grant's character, that tension between his unwavering dedication to duty and service and his personal struggles, including his financial woes. It reminds us that even our greatest heroes are human, with all the imperfections and vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder how differently things might have gone if Grant had been better with money, or if he'd understood public relations better. Could he have avoided some of those scandals?
That's a good question. It really raises interesting questions about the role of public image in shaping a president's legacy. Grant was a man of action, not words. He believed in letting his accomplishments speak for themselves. But in the increasingly media-driven world of the late 19th century, that approach maybe wasn't the best.
It's almost like he was fighting the last war.
Yeah, in a way. He brought that same strategic brilliance and tenacity to the presidency. But the political landscape, well, it demanded a different approach, one that involved shaping public opinion, controlling the narrative.
I wonder what Grant would think about how his reputation is evolving today. Historians are starting to recognize the significance of his first term, the progress he made in advancing civil rights, and they're pushing back against the lost cause myth.
I think he would be gratified to see the truth emerging, to have his accomplishments acknowledged, his contributions to a more just and equitable society celebrated. But I also think he would remain, as he always was, humble and stoic, maybe even a bit bemused by all the attention.
That's an interesting thought. Maybe that's part of what makes him so intriguing. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't seeking the limelight. He just did what he thought was right.
Yeah, even when it was unpopular or difficult.
Exactly.
In that sense. He embodies a certain kind of quiet heroism, one that's often overlooked but no less important.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Ulysses S. Grant, what's the one thing you want our listener to take away?
I hope they see Grant, not just as a name in a history book, but as a complex human being. A man who, despite his flaws and the challenges he faced, played a pivotal role in shaping the course of American history.
A man who fought for what he believed in.
Exactly.
Both on the battlefield and in the political arena.
His story, like all history, is not a simple narrative. It's a tapestry, woven from triumphs and failures, contradictions, and complexities.
And it's up to us to engage with that complexity. To challenge our assumptions. And to seek out the truth.
Even when it's hidden.
If our listeners want to learn more, where should they go?
Well, of course, Ann Marshall's work is a great place to start. And the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State University. But I would also encourage them to look at primary sources. Read Grant's own words in his memoirs. Explore letters and diaries from the period.
Really immerse themselves.
Yes.
There's nothing like reading firsthand accounts.
It's like stepping back in time and hearing the voices of those who lived through those events. And as you explore Grant's story, ask yourself, how would our understanding of history be different? How would we view Reconstruction and its legacy if Grant's first term, with all those achievements in civil rights, had been given the recognition it deserved?
That's a great question. It challenges us to reconsider our assumptions.
It does.
And to consider the power of narrative.
Yes. History is not just about what happened, but also about how we remember it.
Well said. As we learn more about the past, Grant's story becomes even more important.
I agree.
It offers valuable lessons about leadership, resilience, and the pursuit of a more just and equitable society.
A story that deserves to be heard.
Absolutely.
Understood and carried forward.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Ulysses S. Grant.
It's been a pleasure.
The pleasure was mine. And to our listener, thank you for joining us. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging with the complexities of history.
You never know what you might discover.
Happy digging.